What if the story you thought you knew was only the beginning? The air is thick with dust and the scent of iron. The sun hangs low, casting long, trembling shadows over a valley scarred by war. The ground beneath your feet shivers, not from the wind, but from the thunderous steps of something far greater than man. Bronze armor glints in the light, each plate as wide as a man's chest, each movement accompanied by the groan of metal straining under a weight almost unimaginable. From the distance comes the deep, pounding rhythm of war drums, echoing like the heartbeat of a beast that refuses to die. Here, between two ridges, stands the valley of Elah. On one side, the armies of Israel, tense and silent, eyes fixed on the horizon. On the other, the Philistines, a tide of defiance and pride. For days they have faced each other, neither side willing to advance. Then, a shadow moves. It is not the figure of an ordinary warrior. It is something more, something ancient. A giant. You know his name, Goliath. The towering figure with the spear like a weaver's beam, the voice that carried across the valley like a roar in a cavern. The story of the shepherd boy David standing against him has been told for centuries, woven into sermons, children's lessons, and the echoes of our imagination. But what if Goliath's fall was not the end of the giants? What if he was not alone? The Philistines were more than just an army. They were a people with a deep, enduring rivalry against Israel. Their conflict was not only about land or pride, but about survival, faith, and the gods they served. And within their ranks stood warriors whose very size made men falter. Goliath's death was a victory, yes, but also a warning, because legends tell us of his brothers. Imagine this. In our modern lives, giants take many forms. They might not carry spears or wear armor, but they loom over us all the same. Debt, sickness, loss, fear, betrayal. They challenge us, taunt us, whisper that we cannot win. Just as David faced Goliath in the open, you and I face our own towering enemies in the quiet corners of our lives. And if Goliath's brothers walk the earth, perhaps their shadows still walk among us in another form. But before we can understand these other giants, before we can meet them, we have to return to this battlefield. The Valley of Elah was more than a location on a map. It was a proving ground, a place where the courage of one boy rippled through the pages of history. His victory would shake the Philistines, inspire the Israelites, and send a message to every nation watching. Size alone does not decide the outcome of a battle. Still, every victory leaves questions in its wake. The Israelites might have asked themselves, if Goliath was real, what of the others? Were there more giants scattered across the land, hidden in other cities? Were they preparing for revenge? For some, the thought was unshakable. The Philistine army, even in retreat, might have whispered the names of their other champions, names known only in the quiet of campfires, names that would one day step out from the shadows. The Bible offers hints, subtle as they may be, that Goliath's family was not yet gone. And those hints lead us to an untold chapter, one that takes us beyond the familiar duel between shepherd and giant and into the mystery of a forgotten bloodline. In this journey, we will not only uncover who these brothers were, but also the legacy they carried. We will walk through their world, understand their place in history, and ask why their stories were left in the shadows while Goliath's name blazed bright. Because history, especially the kind written in ancient scripture, often hides more than it reveals. And perhaps, just perhaps, when we look at these giants, we will see more than warriors, oars from a distant age. We will see reflections of the battles we fight now. Different weapons, different fields, but the same challenge. Will we stand or will we flee? So, as we step deeper into this story, I want to invite you to be part of it. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Bible Says channel so you don't miss the rest of this journey. And if you believe in the work we're doing, bringing these ancient truths to light, consider sending a super thanks to help us keep going. Before we move on, I'd love to hear from you. Write your name, your city, and even the exact time you're watching this in the comments below. It's amazing to see where and when people around the world join in these stories. And if you want to go even deeper, you can get the complete 88 Books Bible along with the Book of Enoch in English. The link is right there in the description. This is more than just a book. It's a doorway into the full scope of what's been passed down to us. Because what comes next will take us further than we've ever gone before. Though their origins were unlike anything the earth had ever seen, they were referred to as mighty men of old, men of renown. According to the ancient texts, giants, beings of extraordinary size, strength, and violence, were created when the sons of God married the daughters of men. Genesis 6:4. These were not just tall men, they were the children of a forbidden union, a mixture of the mortal and the divine that went against the natural order. This story is elaborated in the Book of Enoch, a work that has been preserved outside of the conventional canon but is highly valued in the Ethiopian Bible. It tells of the Watchers, angels who came to earth, took human wives, and produced a race whose thirst for corruption and power destroyed everything in their path. The earth was cursed by their presence. In Enoch's story, these giants not only devoured human labor, but also resorted to violence when food became in short supply. They spread fear throughout the land, drank the blood of living things, and ate them. The Most High decided that this corruption could not continue after the earth's cries reached the heavens. According to both Genesis and Enoch, the Great Flood was a judgment on these alien creatures as well as a means of purging human immorality. However, the question remains, how come giants are still mentioned in the later history of Israel if the flood wiped out all life except that which was saved in the ark? Goliath's and similar characters' appearances imply that the bloodline has survived. This is the subject of several theories. Some suggest that after the flood, similar unions may have occurred during a second incursion. Others contend that some giant clans persisted among Noah's descendants, possibly via his sons' wives, carrying with them the traces of that ancient, tainted lineage. The old names have a backstory. Scripture describes the Rephaim as fierce fighters that the surrounding nations dreaded. The last of the Rephaim, King Og of Bashan, is described in Deuteronomy 3 as having a bed that was more than 13 feet long, a clear indication of his size and strength. Then came the Anakim, who were descended from Anak, and whose presence in Canaan alarmed Moses' spies. Their terrified report, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them," is recorded in number 13. These were desperate attempts to convey the astonishment of standing in the shadow of something that appeared to be larger than man. They were not hyperbolic words intended to evoke fear. The giant bloodline also appeared to have found a home among the Philistines. Scripture mentions his brothers, who were giants with armor and weapons that regular men could hardly lift. And Goliath of Gath was one of several known champions from his city, as living reminders of an ancient rebellion that started long before David ever stepped foot on the battlefield. These Philistine giants came to represent defiance against Israel. The Ethiopian Bible offers a more comprehensive look at their past. The Book of Enoch and other preserved texts within its canon explain how the nations were still influenced by the giants' blood even after their physical prowess had diminished. It talks of spirits that people leave behind after they die, agitated, evil creatures that roam the world, igniting conflict and causing strife. According to this story, the giants' legacy included both their imposing bodies and the spiritual decay they left behind. Even in the post-flood world, remnants of their presence were ingrained in the ancient people's memories and geography. These creatures came to be identified with areas such as Philistia, Bashan, and the Canaanite hill country. Some locations had echoes of the Rephaim or Anakim in their very names, as though the land itself remembered them. Massive walls, enormous weapons, and odd burial sites discovered during archaeological excavations have stoked conjecture that the biblical stories were inspired by actual experiences with people of extraordinary size and power. Deeper inquiries concerning the world's spiritual past are brought up by the persistence of these bloodlines. Why were these creatures permitted to persist after the flood if the flood was intended to eradicate the corruption? Was it a test for God's people, a reminder that future generations would need to have the same bravery and faith as Noah? Or was it the lasting effect of a rebellion that was too great to be wiped out in a single act of judgment? According to some legends, these post-flood giants were smaller than their pre-flood predecessors, but still powerful. Their descendants may not have achieved the enormous heights of their ancestors because, according to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers were imprisoned in the depths and unable to return to the earth. However, their physical and spiritual strength was still sufficient to influence nations' anxieties and plans. In addition to using swords and spears, soldiers fought knowing that they were up against a force connected to the most sinister and ancient periods of human history. The defeat of giants frequently had a deeper significance in the Hebrew scriptures. In addition to being the triumph of a young shepherd over an armed warrior, David's victory over Goliath was the most recent in a long line of conflicts between God's people and the remaining members of this ancient bloodline. Every triumph served as a reminder that the Almighty's plan and promise could not be opposed, no matter how formidable the adversary. When we take into account the city of Gath, the Philistine connection to these bloodlines becomes even more fascinating. It served as a stronghold for other giant warriors in addition to being the home of Goliath. Chronicles mentions two physical oddities that might allude to their mixed ancestry: Lami, Goliath's brother, and an unnamed giant with 24 fingers and toes. These specifics, which are recorded in the Bible, are not mere trivialities. Rather, they serve as a reminder that Israel's adversaries were the descendants of a more ancient and profound animosity, rather than just rival political parties. Giants are remembered in cultures all over the world, even outside of biblical tradition. Before the flood, great men and demigods ruled, according to ancient Sumerian texts. The Titans were enormous creatures who once posed a threat to the gods, according to Greek mythology. A recurring theme in all of these traditions is that the earth was once home to powerful beings who fell because of pride and disobedience. This is supported by the biblical story, which also provides a particular genealogy, tracing a direct line from the Watchers to the anti-Israel post-flood giants. Tracing the ancestry of the Rephaim, Anakim, and Philistines reveals a thread that connects the earliest scripture chapters to the subsequent conflicts of kings and prophets, not just a historical curiosity. These names are significant markers in a centuries-long tale of rebellion, judgment, and redemption. They are not arbitrary. The fact that these bloodlines survived the deluge is both a mystery and evidence of the enduring character of the biblical spiritual struggle. Thus, there were still enough giants to serve as living reminders that the ancient conflict between heaven and earth was still ongoing, albeit not as many as before, or as tall as they had been before the flood. Nor were they inflated stories to exalt triumphs, nor were they myths carved to terrify children. They belonged to a reality that influenced the course of nations, a reality whose echoes are still audible when we read the scriptures and picture the earth quivering under the feet of men who were more than men. One of the 5 major Philistine cities, Gath's name alone evoked strength and defiance. It was a strategic stronghold and a gateway to the center of Israel because of its location in the Shephelah, a lowland area between the Judean hills and the coastal plain. The city's high location allowed it to dominate the trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia, as well as the fertile valleys. Gath's population and the armies it built to protect its boundaries were fed by the abundance of crops and grazing grounds in the surrounding area. This was no small village. Gath was a hub of power, wealth, and military prowess that rivaled the power of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gaza, its sister cities. One should not undervalue the Philistines who lived in Gath. Centuries of migration and conflict had molded their culture, and they brought skills that distinguished them from their neighbors. The I came from the sea, probably from the Aegean region, and were skilled in trade, metalworking, and seafaring. Their economy was based on both craftsmanship and agriculture. Their forges produced armor, chariots, and iron weapons, which gave them a technological edge over many of the nearby tribes. An opponent with sharper weapons, more robust armor, and unrelenting training was what one would encounter when facing a Philistine warrior. Even so, Gath stood out from the other Philistine cities. Its reputation was based on the caliber of its warriors, as well as its strategic location and economic might. Giants, literally tall, powerful men whose presence on the battlefield evoked equal parts fear and wonder, lived here. The most well-known of them, Goliath, was over 9 feet tall and weighed more than most men could carry due to his armor. The iron head of his spear alone weighed several kilograms, and its shaft resembled a weaver's beam. However, Goliath wasn't alone. Scripture and historical memory describe other people who were similar to him in size and skill, his brothers and kin. These champions had bred in Gath for generations, and their names were pronounced in Israel with a mix of reverence and fear. A protracted and acrimonious rivalry preceded the conflict between Gath and Israel. While Israel sought to safeguard its inheritance from God, the Philistines had pushed inland in an attempt to seize important territories. As both sides tested each other's strength, alliances changed and skirmishes broke out along borders. However, the balance of power shifted dramatically when Gath's giants entered the field. They were a physical representation of the challenges Israel faced in both faith and war, and their size alone made them a living symbol of the Philistine challenge. Gath's topography made defense easier. The city could be protected from siege by the natural elevations and fertile lands surrounding it. It was surrounded by earthworks and stone walls, with gates big enough to let chariots and trade caravans pass through. With spears blazing like a forest of steel and shields shining in the sunlight, Philistine armies would advance from these gates to confront their adversaries. The lowlands below provided space for massive battle formations, which was ideal for the giants of Gath to show off their power. We can see hints of what life might have been like in this city thanks to archaeology. Large fortifications, grinding stones big enough to feed armies, and the remnants of workshops where metal was forged and shaped into weapons have all been found during excavations at Tel Es-Safi, which is commonly thought to be the ancient site of Gath. Artifacts that imply the existence of warriors of unusual size are among the most fascinating discoveries. Spear tips that are larger and heavier than usual give away the type of weapons that the city's champions may have used. It is hard to overlook the connection between these findings and the biblical descriptions, even though some academics advise against making snap judgments. Gath's military power was disciplined and well organized. The use of heavy infantry backed by chariots and archers was a hallmark of Philistine forces. Despite their small numbers, giants were shock troops who frightened the enemy before the fight even started. Opposing forces' morale could be damaged by their mere presence, causing them to falter or disband out of fear. The giants of Gath were one of the Philistines' greatest assets during a time when psychological warfare was just as effective as physical force. However, war was not the only aspect of Gath life. Through trade with nearby areas, the city's economy grew, exchanging goods like wine, grain, olive oil, and handcrafted goods. With its unique patterns and methods, the Philistines' proficiency in pottery shaped their cultural identity and extended their influence well beyond their boundaries. The city's markets were teeming with farmers, craftspeople, and merchants. Gath's position as a dominant power in the area was further strengthened by the money made from this trade, which was used to build temples, public structures, and fortifications. With temples devoted to their gods like Dagon, religion was also very important in Philistine culture. In Gath, worship was intimately linked to their strength and sense of self. The existence of giants among them was possibly interpreted as a sign that their gods favored them with champions that no other nation could match, and battle victories were praised as gifts from their gods. Because each side felt they were fighting for the sake of their own god, the war with Israel was therefore not just political or military, but also spiritual. When Goliath of Gath challenged the Israelite armies, the rivalry reached its most famous point. It was a test of bravery, faith, and divine support more than a simple duel. Although his defeat by David did not immediately put an end to Gath's power, it was a symbolic blow that had an impact on succeeding generations. Goliath's city continued to be a source of trouble for Israel even after he was vanquished, producing more warriors to carry on the battle. Other encounters with Gath's giants are documented in the Bible, including men who have peculiar physical characteristics, like 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, which emphasizes their individuality and the enduring influence of their ancestry. They caused fear, but Gath fell in the end. Its strength was undermined by successive campaigns by Israel and other regional powers. The markets were quieted, the once great walls were breached, and the giants, whether killed in combat or lost to time, became legendary. However, the memory of Gath's power has persisted, whispered in the history books and preserved in scripture. Archaeologists are now touching the remains of a city that was once the epicenter of Philistine defiance as they dig through the layers of Tel Esafi, not just finding stones and pottery. Every fragment of an enormous weapon, every wall of a fortification, and every artifact all point to a place where giants once roamed and nations shuddered. By comprehending Gath, we get a glimpse of the world that influenced the David and Goliath story, not as a standalone legend, but rather as a component of a culture, conflict, and the ongoing struggle between rival peoples. The biblical account of Gath as a city of giants is not the only example of how geography, economics, and military ambition can combine to form a power whose influence extends well beyond its boundaries. Gath was more than just a city in its day. It was a symbol, a stronghold of pride and power, a place where the sound of swordplay and the thunder of warriors could be heard throughout the plains. And even though its walls have been silent for centuries, the stories that continue to captivate the interest of people who want to learn about the ancient world still contain the echoes of its giants. Long before his name would reverberate across battlefields, Goliath was only a boy in the heart of Gath. But even as a young man, he was unique. His broad frame, massive hands, and strength were already the talk of the city, and he was taller than his peers before he had even reached manhood. The burden of expectation that hung over him from the moment he could walk, however, was what really made him stand out, not just his size. Goliath was born into a family known for its warriors, a lineage whose name evoked the memory of giants who had fought Israel for many generations. It was clear from the moment of his birth that he was not meant to lead a typical life. His father, who had fought innumerable battles, taught him the customs of their people, including the discipline, the art of war, and the unwavering devotion to family and city. Training started early. The fundamentals were taught first: how to balance the weight of a wooden spear, how to move soundlessly in spite of his size, and how to read the terrain like a hunter. However, the intensity of his preparation increased with his size. His mornings started with drills that would break lesser men, leather armor was replaced by heavy bronze, and iron weights took the place of wood. He learned to march for miles without stopping, and to use weapons so large that regular soldiers could not even lift them in the sweltering fields outside of Gath. On this journey, Goliath was not by himself. The same was true for his brothers, who were also men of remarkable size and strength. Each had a unique fighting style and skill that had been refined via constant practice. Since they realized that their combined presence on the battlefield was a force stronger than the sum of their individual parts, they trained together in coordinated maneuvers. Sweat, blood, and the unwavering reminder that their survival and glory depended on one another were the ingredients that forged their bond, which went beyond simple familial ties. They had made an unwritten pledge when they were young: If a brother was still alive to fight, none of them would ever confront an enemy by themselves. There were many tales of their ancestors' triumphs. At night, around the fire, elders would recount battles in which their kin had overcome overwhelming odds with courage and strength. These stories served as identity lessons as well as entertainment. As they grew up, Goliath and his brothers realized they were the living embodiment of that legacy, carrying on a line that some people believed extended back to the Nephilim, the powerful ancient people mentioned in sacred texts. They felt a sense of obligation as well as pride because of this belief. A loss in combat was more than just a personal setback. It was a disgrace to their entire family. They were shaped in part by the city of Gath itself. Troops, armorers, and strategists crowded its streets and marketplaces. War was a part of the city's pulse. From sunrise to sunset, training grounds echoed with the clash of weapons, and festivals honored military triumphs. The giants were revered by young boys who viewed them as living representations of power and defense. The public's awe of Goliath and his brothers served as a continual reminder that they carried not only the pride of their family, but also the aspirations of the city. Their training as teenagers went beyond simple fighting techniques. They learned strategy, including how to predict enemy force movements, entice an adversary into unfavorable terrain, and adjust when plans don't work out. They learned from their mentors that a warrior's mind needed to be as sharp as his blade, and that strength without wisdom could be abused. Similar to his prowess in physical feats, Goliath was also a master at leading small groups of soldiers in simulated combat. His brothers did the same, and the three of them made up a strong core of Gath's military leadership. Even during training exercises, they demonstrated their shared code of protection. One brother was there to key over the other if he stumbled. The others fought back together if one was struck. Their enemies would learn to fear this unity, which became a defining characteristic. To challenge one of these brothers was to invite the wrath of all the Philistines, so the saying went. If one was insulted, even in the city, the others would stand up to protect his honor. They operated under the tenet that their power increased when they were united and decreased when they were separated. Their everyday routines, which went beyond the discipline of combat, served to further solidify their status as a warrior family. They ate meals together in a large hall while exchanging tales of their training and successes throughout the day. They offered sacrifices to their gods in order to gain their protection and favor prior to battle. Knowing that a dull blade or weakened armor could spell death, they took great care to maintain their weapons. They were always ready for the call to arms and lived as soldiers, even when they were at rest. The brothers became the pride of Gath's army as they matured into fully grown men. Their legend was further enhanced by the scars they wore from training and battles. Being the tallest and strongest, Goliath inevitably assumed a leadership role, but he never considered himself superior to his siblings. He treated them as equals in the struggle rather than as subordinates, because he understood that their bond was the basis of their power. Together, they created an impenetrable barrier of steel and flesh that no adversary wanted to breach. Beyond Gath's boundaries, rumors of their skill started to circulate. Tales of battles in which his brothers repulsed entire enemy charges, and of sparring matches in which Goliath could drive a spear through a target at impossibly long distances, were brought to other cities by traders and travelers. Whether or not they were exaggerated, these tales had a calculated function. They made prospective enemies fearful before the giants ever set foot on the battlefield. They were already mentally half-defeated when an enemy force confronted them. The brothers' relationship was repeatedly put to the test in actual combat. Their abilities and unity were put to the test in battles with rival Philistine factions, borderland raids, and skirmishes with Israelite forces. They exhibited an implicit comprehension of one another's actions and intentions in every interaction, responding as if they were acting with a single thought. His brothers flanked Goliath when he charged, and when one was encircled, the others carved a way out to release him. Their family name thus came to represent both fierceness and devotion. Goliath never lost sight of the legacy he was creating. Although he was aware that his triumphs would be remembered for a long time after his passing, he also knew that his brothers shared in each victory equally. They were his lifeblood in battle, not just his allies, because it was forged not only through training, but also through a lifetime of shared hardship, victory, and sacrifice. Their unity was unmatched by any army. Goliath was already a skilled fighter who had been shaped by years of training by the time the world outside of Gath got to know him. His weapons were an extension of his will, his armor shone in the sunlight, and he exuded complete confidence when fighting. The brothers who fought alongside him, bonded to him by blood, honor, and a vow that they would fight the world's battles together, no matter the cost, were his greatest strength, as those who knew him well realized. A crowd could be quieted by the warrior Ishbibonob's mere presence. Even among the giants, his body was enormous, and he seemed to be carrying the weight of inevitable fate with every step. His armor, which was made of thick plates of bronze that had been hammered to withstand even the most severe blows, was a work of brutal craftsmanship. Rather than your typical battlefield equipment. The metal groaned softly under its own weight with every step, clinging to him like a second skin. For Ishbibonob, it was as natural as wearing cloth, but for most men, the sheer weight of it would have crushed them. The deep dents strewn across his armor's surface told tales of innumerable battles fought, and the glint of his armor in the sun was said to blind oncoming foes. However, Ishbibonob's weapon, a huge spear known as the Spear of Death, was his real source of fear. The spearhead was a hideous wedge of sharpened iron, so heavy that a regular soldier could hardly lift it, and the shaft was made of seasoned hardwood, thicker than a man's wrist. However, it moved with startling speed in Ishbibonob's hands, hissing through the air before diving into flesh, armor, and shields. His rhythm was savage and calculated, and he struck with a force that, without piercing a man, could knock him off his feet. The weapon was more than just a war tool. It was a manifestation of Ishbibonob's will, a declaration that his adversaries would perish beneath its shadow. His successes in border skirmishes, where he stood alone against entire squads of enemy soldiers, were legendary among the Philistines. He used a combination of brute force and vicious shrewdness in his combat, driving his adversaries back with strong thrusts before abruptly changing course to take advantage of a weakness in their defenses. Like a storm that would not go away, his fighting style was unrelenting. He was not interested in protracted conflicts. When Ishbibonob joined the fight, he aimed for quick and easy victories. When Israel's warriors heard the stories, they became fearful and determined. There were rumors that one of David's strong men, who were known for their valor and skill, would one day confront this giant. Israel and the Philistines were engaged in a bloody war at the time of that day. Ishbibonob had become a literal and symbolic spearhead of the Philistine advances, and the armies had fought repeatedly over control of strategic areas. Ishbibonob first faced one of David's champions during one of these battles, which took place under a sky that smelled strongly of rain. The air was heavy with the clash of steel and the cries of men, and the ground was muddy. Ishbibonob's figure appeared through the confusion, looming over the battleground, his spear shining in spite of the ominous clouds. That day, he faced off against Abishai, a valiant and skilled warrior who was fiercely loyal to David. The field appeared to close in on them the instant their gazes locked. Because they didn't want to be caught between these two forces, soldiers naturally separated. Ishbibonob was the first to move, and for a man of his size, his spear swept forward with incredible speed. The blow rattled through Abishai's arms and knocked him back a few steps as he barely deflected it. With each thrust of his spear and each step that shook the sodden ground, the giant pressed the attack. In an attempt to find a gap, Abishai retaliated with slashes and feints. But Ishbibonob's armor repelled his blows like rain off stone. Their conflict turned into a show. Above the clamor of the wider battle came the clang of metal on metal. Abishai's shield started to crack under the force of Ishbibonob's strikes. Despite the intensity of his attacks, the giant's breaths were deep and steady, and his eyes were burning with the excitement of the kill. Abishai understood that he could not prevail in a contest of sheer strength. He would need to depend on the giant's own momentum, timing, and agility. Shortly after that initial encounter, Ishbibonob was involved in the final battle that determined his fate. The giants could easily control the battle because the Philistines had gathered in large numbers close to a narrow pass. Israel's army, under the command of David's men, advanced into the pass, despite being fully aware of the danger they would face. As Ishbibonob took his place at the head of the Philistine line, the sunlight glinted off his armor in the clear sky that day. He already had his spear in his hand, the tip pointing like a challenge toward the approaching enemy. Ishbibonob charged forward as the two armies engaged in combat, his enormous strides bringing him all the way to the center of Israel's ranks. The iron tip of his spear punched through shields like parchment, taking down soldier after soldier. He was almost impervious to counterattacks thanks to his armor, and the Israelites were alarmed by his mere presence. Abishai, however, saw his opportunity. Abishai crouched low behind the shield of a fallen comrade and watched as Ishbibonob swung his spear in a broad arc to clear the area around him. Despite its strength, the movement left the giant's left side open just enough for a heartbeat. Leaping forward, Abishai slammed his own blade into the space between the giant's arm and breastplate. With more anger than pain, Ishbibonob roared and swung the spear down hard enough to knock Abishai to his knees. The fight devolved into a lethal dance, with Ishbibonob countering with bone-crushing sweeps of his weapon, while Abishai darted in and out of reach, slashing at the giant's armor's weak spots. Abishai finally pretended to stumble, luring Ishbibonob into a thrust forward that was intended to finish him. Abishai rolled away in that moment, allowing the giant's momentum to drive the spear far into the ground. Abishai rushed upward, slamming his sword with all of his might into the exposed area beneath the giant's arm before Ishbibonob could recover. The roar of the battlefield drowned out the sound of steel tearing through flesh. Ishbibonob stumbled, his huge body wobbling as if the earth had moved under him. The great weapon dropped to the ground, useless, as his spear slipped from his grasp. A shudder went through the ground as the giant fell with a final guttural growl. The sight of their champion falling caused the Philistine line to falter. Fear now gripped the soldiers, who had found courage in Ishbibonob's invincibility. Encouraged by Abishai's victory, the Israelites advanced with newfound strength and forced their adversaries to retreat through the pass. Abishai saw the moment as more than just his own victory. It was also a setback to the Philistine morale and a victory for David's men. Ishbibonob's great spear was brought back to Gath as a reminder of his fall and a memento of his strength when his body was later recovered by his surviving family. For years to come, the battlefield where he died would be remembered not only as a site of death, but also as the scene of a battle between two fighters with unparalleled skill and tenacity. Despite his passing, Ishbibonob's legacy would endure in both sides' tales as the frightful bearer of the spear of death and as the fallen giant who encountered one of David's most powerful men. In contrast to the majority of Philistine giants whose legends proliferated through terror and roaring violence, Saph was also referred to in some accounts as Sippai. Saph came with an eerie, unnerving calm where others roared into battle. He was a predator who didn't need to be intimidated to rule the field, so his silence wasn't the result of shyness or self-control. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a fortress-like frame, as if he viewed every enemy soldier as a piece to be taken out of the chessboard and measured the battlefield. Every move appeared methodical, patient, and calculated. He was revered by the Philistines for his unwavering discipline as well as his size and skill. He didn't waste words boasting or shouting his triumphs. Saph saw himself as the most refined instrument in the craft of war. His armor was made of layered leather and heavy bronze, and it was intended to be both effective and protective. His body was embraced by the plates, which made it possible for him to move with surprisingly dexterity, considering his enormous size. He also held a weapon that embodied his character in his hand, a huge double-edged sword that was simple and functional, its weight alone enough to shatter smaller blades in a single parry. Saph was a moving wall on the battlefield. He approached his enemies methodically and steadily, rather than rashly. He struck with accuracy, intending to kill or incapacitate without wasting energy. Soldiers who had to deal with him frequently described the oppressive pressure they felt. There were no frantic yelling or tumultuous swings, just the unrelenting march of a giant who appeared to be unaffected by fear or exhaustion. As he closed in, enemies could hear the crunch of soil beneath his feet and the pounding of their own hearts, and his silence only increased the sense of dread. Particularly following a string of raids in the lowlands, in which entire squads of Israelite soldiers were slain by his blade, the news of his triumphs quickly spread. Although Saph was not known for leaving survivors, those who did manage to get away shared stories that contributed to the Philistine myth of the silent giant. However, these tales served as warnings to the Israelites, whispers of an impending danger that they could not ignore. Near the Giza border, Israel and the Philistines engaged in a crucial battle that would determine Saph's destiny. Recent victories had given the Philistine forces more confidence, and Saph had been positioned at the vanguard of their military offensive. Both armies had areas to regroup and ambush due to the battlefield's combination of rocky terrain and sporadic trees. Shouts, the clash of steel, the thud of arrows hitting shields, the sounds of battle reverberated across the hills as the fighting broke out. However, Saph's silent advance created an odd contrast to that chaos, as if the sound of battle were just bending around him. He was instantly recognized by Israel's soldiers. He was unmistakably large and composed. Sibbecai the Hushathite, a seasoned warrior renowned for his skill against opponents with heavy armor, was one of David's powerful men who was particularly prepared to take on the challenge. Sibbecai approached Saph with the silent determination of someone who recognized the gravity of the situation, while others stayed out of his way. This was no typical duel. Rather, it was a test of skill, determination, and fortitude in the face of an opponent who seemed invincible. Their initial interaction was harsh. Sibbecai lifted his shield just in time to take the blow as Saph's sword descended in a powerful arc. The wood of his shield groaned under the force of the impact, which almost knocked him to his knees. The giant sidestepped with unexpected ease and retaliated with a sweeping cut that made Sibbecai jump back when he countered with a sharp thrust towards Saph's midsection. The battle found a tense rhythm, with Sibbecai circling and searching for a weakness while Saph advanced steadily. Saph's poise had an unsettling quality. The giant's face remained the same even after Sibbecai's blade lightly cut his arm, leaving a thin line of blood. He didn't lash out in rage or roar in pain. Rather, he repositioned himself, repositioned his hold, and continued his unrelenting advance. Sibbecai was forced to concede ground inch by inch as each blow from his sword carried the weight of a battering ram. However, Sibbecai started to see a gap in Saph's very consistency. Despite being destructive, the giant's attacks had a systematic pattern. At regular intervals, he raised his guard, timed his swings, and measured his steps. It was a master's mark, but it also indicated that he fought in a rigid manner that was susceptible to interference. When the time came, Saph pressed forward and delivered. At another forceful overhead blow with his sword. Instead of merely deflecting it with his shield, Sibbecai twisted his body, allowing the blow to slightly deflect the giant's weapon. Saph's defenses were slightly lowered in that brief moment. Sibbecai sprang forward, aiming his blade at the opening beneath the giant's chest plate. Saph was forced to stumble back for the first time by the deep strike. The giant did not scream even then. He seemed to be silently appreciating Sibbecai's skill as his eyes met his. Dark against the bronze of his armor, blood dripped from the wound, but he remained unflinching. Rather, he pushed forward once more, intent on completing the battle. Sibbecai was aware that he could not take many more of those debilitating hits. He had to cut it short. Sibbecai shifted to the left, catching the giant's attention long enough to move to his right as Saph raised his sword for another blow. He struck the inside of Saph's leg, where the armor was weakest, with a strong upward slash. The giant was forced to drop to one knee due to the deep cut that severed muscle. Saph did not fall easily even then. He made a desperate arc with his sword, but Sibbecai dodged it, moved in close, and stabbed the giant in the throat. Saph was killed by the silence that had characterized his life. The battle around them seemed to be temporarily quieted as he fell slowly, his huge body striking the ground with a deep, resonant thud. The Israelites charged forward with new vigor as the Philistines faltered after witnessing the fall of their champion. For a moment, Sibbecai stood over the fallen giant, his chest heaving with fatigue. He was aware that this victory would live on in history, not only because it eliminated one of the Philistines' most dreaded fighters, but also because it demonstrated that even the most formidable force could be defeated with equal tenacity. The quiet inevitability that had accompanied every step of the silent giant's reign had ended, rather than with the thunder of battle. Goliath of Gath's brother, Lami, had a name that reverberated with the weight of his family's standing. Lami's presence was characterized by a cold, calculated intensity, in contrast to Goliath's towering arrogance and thunderous taunts. His fighting style distinguished him from other Philistine warriors, despite the fact that he was just as large as his brother, with broad shoulders, long limbs, and a frame that appeared to have been carved for battle. Lami served as a combat technician. His strikes were not the result of sheer force. They were accurate, designed to take advantage of vulnerabilities, and performed with a precision that bordered on surgical. A spear in his hands became an extension of his will, and despite its small size, it moved with lethal speed. According to stories passed down among the Philistines, Lami's style was a unique combination of strength and speed for a giant. Lami's movements carried an elegance that seemed almost at odds with his massive frame, in contrast to most of his kin who used overwhelming power to crush opponents. In order to anticipate his opponent's reactions and counter before they had a chance to recover, he would feint, shift, and adjust mid-strike. His preferred weapon was a long-shafted spear with a polished iron blade that was so sharp that it could both pierce armor from a distance and be used devastatingly in close quarters. Even though he was not as well known as Goliath, Lami was still a formidable warrior. He won many of the battles between Israel and the Philistines along the border. Stories circulated about ambushes in the Shephelah Hills, where Israelite scouts would be killed by Lami's spear before they even realized a giant was present. His methods worked so well that in some villages, people would whisper his name as a warning that anyone caught in his path would undoubtedly die. However, Lami's most memorable combat experience occurred during the conflict that ensued after his brother's passing. The Philistines were rocked to their foundations by Goliath's defeat at the hands of David, but Goliath's family members also felt a fierce desire for retribution. No one took that burden more personally than Lami. The honor of his lineage demanded vengeance, and his pride was wounded. With his spear gleaming in the midday sun, Lami led the Philistine army as they assembled for battle once more. There was a man who had gained a reputation as a giant killer among the Israelites across the field. Although his name was not as permanently recorded as David's, his actions had already started to establish his place in the annals of Israel's military history. Although the records are few and conflicting, it might have been Elhanan of Bethlehem, as some stories claim. Whoever he was, this warrior refused to be intimidated by the size of his opponent and had the guts to take on the imposing Lami head-on. The actual battlefield was tense and uneasy. The open area between the two champions was the focal point of attention, despite the sound of swords clashing and arrows hissing. Slowly moving toward his opponent, Lami traced an invisible line with the tip of his spear. Sword held low but ready, the Israelite fighter matched his stride. With every step, the impending clash seemed to get closer. Lami struck with the swiftness of a slashing serpent. The Israelite had to make a narrow sidestep as his spear shot forward in a blur. A quick parry deflected the second thrust, which was even faster and aimed for the midsection. Lami refused to back down and continued to attack, putting his opponent's defenses to the test with each blow. The Israelite resisted, waiting for Lami to put too much effort into a single assault. The duel played out like a dance of death. The Israelites' agility allowed him to weave in and out of range, but Lami's reach helped him hold his opponent at bay. The Israelite moved closer each time Lami lunged, closing the distance that allowed the giant to gain the upper hand. Lami started to adapt, forcing his opponent to back off with sweeping arcs of his spear, but he resisted. Lami was unprepared for the abrupt change in the fight's rhythm. After attracting Lami's attention with a feint to the left, the Israelite quickly moved to the right, entering the giant's spear's arc. Lami responded swiftly, blocking with a tight circle of his weapon, but the move knocked him off balance. The Israelite warrior delivered a strong slash to Lami's thigh, where the armor was thinnest in that heartbeat of unrest. The giant staggered as the blade went deep. Lami continued to fight despite her wounds. He attempted to drive the iron tip into his opponent's chest by changing his grip and transforming the spear into a short weapon. However, now that he had the upper hand, the Israelite ducked once more and cut Lami's forearm. The spear clattered to the ground after slipping out of the giant's grasp. Lami's enormous hands made a last-ditch effort to subdue his opponent, but the Israelite was too fast. He drove his blade beneath the giant's breastplate with a single forceful upward stroke, piercing the giant's heart deep. The sounds of battle seemed to fade, and Lami fell to his knees, the world around him spinning. He was merely a warrior whose time had come in that instant. He was no longer the feared champion of the Philistines or the avenging of his brother's death. His body shook the ground beneath him as he fell forward. With his chest heaving and the tip of his sword dark with the giant's blood, the Israelite took a step back. Unlike the death of Goliath, the fall of Lami did not reverberate throughout history. No magnificent retellings took place in the courts of kings, and no great songs were written in the streets of Jerusalem. His story was overshadowed by the more well-known accounts of his brother's defeat. However, Lami's demise was equally important to the warrior who faced him and to those who fought that day. It served as yet another reminder that anyone could challenge a champion on the battlefield and prevail, regardless of their size or level of skill. Lami's passing was a bitter blow to the Philistines, not because their most renowned warrior was gone, but rather because it broke another connection to a lineage that had previously seemed unbreakable. In a protracted battle for survival, it was another win for the Israelites. It was a personal victory for the unnamed giant killer, one that would live on in his memory for the rest of his life, even though it might never be sung in ballads. According to legend, the spear that Lami had wielded so expertly was claimed as a trophy, and its heavy weight demonstrated the strength of the person who had previously wielded it. It turned into a silent reminder of a conflict that few would recall in depth, but whose conclusion influenced the precarious equilibrium between two ancient countries. Lami's legacy came to an end in the dust of that forgotten field, not with the roar of glory, but with the sobering realization that even giants can fail. He was a figure whose very presence unnerved both friends and foes, unlike any other warrior to have fought in the ancient Near East. Even by the Rephaim's standards, his frame was enormous and towering. However, his peculiar and eerie physical deformity, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, was what made him unique and sent shivers through every camp that heard of him. A total of 24 digits, each one strong, thick, and symmetrical in an unsettling way. Some saw it as an indication of unrivaled strength, a genetic gift that increased his grip strength, balance, and force of blows. Others saw it as a bad sign, evidence that there was something strange in his lineage that made it difficult to distinguish between the divine and the human. He was referred to as a living mystery by the Philistines. Before him, no man born in Gath was known to have possessed this quality, and the elders whispered that his mother had been visited as a child by a shadowy figure, neither spirit nor man, who had bestowed upon her a peculiar blessing or curse. Nobody knew if that was superstition or a warped version of reality. There was no doubt that this giant's hands and feet appeared to be practically made for combat. He had perfect balance on uneven terrain and an unwavering grip on a sword. Because of his unusual hands, he was able to manipulate weapons in ways that other warriors could not imagine, and he was able to climb rocky terrain without slipping. He received early training in the art of fear in addition to physical combat. His teachers understood that his physical deformity could be used as a weapon in and of itself. The sight of those six-fingered hands sent shivers down the spines of the enemy when he strode into battle without gloves or coverings. Some warriors hesitated, certain that they were dealing with a being that was touched by something that was beyond human comprehension, not just a man. Some viewed him as a dark hero, possibly descended from the Nephilim who lived on Earth before the deluge. Even before he fought his first battle, he was already a living legend in Philistine culture, where myths of gods and heroes were woven into the fabric of history. He could snap a spear shaft with his bare hands or wrestle a bull to the ground, according to rumors that his strength came directly from the gods. He was able to use oversized weapons such as double-gripped swords, enormous javelins and shields so heavy that no regular man could carry them. Into battle for more than a few minutes, thanks to his unique build. For hours he carried them easily. His early triumphs only added to the mystery surrounding him. He moved with a quickness that belied his size in skirmishes against Israelite patrols. According to witnesses, he used one of his great hands to catch a spear in midair, broke it in two, and threw the shattered shaft back at its owner. He became a phantom in the minds of Israel's warriors long before they ever saw him, regardless of whether that story was true or the fabrication of amazed survivors. However, no matter how strong the myth, it cannot alter the reality that every warrior's tale will ultimately be put to the test in combat. One day, in the dust and blood of battle, this six-fingered giant faced the Israelite armies, not in rumors. Long shadows were cast over the valley where the two forces converged by the low sun. The air was filled with shouts, metal clashing, and arrows thudding against shields. The Philistine ranks then parted, and he came out like the opening of a great curtain. His armor glinted in the sunlight. The bronze plates, each engraved with images of exotic animals, were precisely sized to fit his massive frame. He held a huge, almost ceremonial-looking sword in his right hand, but it was obvious from the casual ease with which he held it that it was intended for murder. The iron tip of the spear, which was thicker than a man's wrist, gleamed menacingly in his left hand, and the Israelites' front line became uneasy as they noticed the strange symmetry of his fingers curling around the hilts. One of David's strong men, a seasoned combatant who had encountered giants in the past, but never one like this, was the champion he faced that day. There was only the silent, purposeful closing of the gap between the two, no verbal exchange or taunts like Goliath had once thrown. With deliberate strides and extra toes that anchored him to the ground, the giant moved like a predator. When the clash did occur, it was loud. The giant's initial blow was an overhead swing intended to completely crush his opponent, but the Israelite fighter rolled away, sending stones and dirt flying as the blade struck the ground. The counterattack was swift, a slash at the giant's flank, but the warrior's wrist was caught in the middle of the strike by the six-fingered hand. The Israelite felt his forearm's bones strain under the force of the firm grip. Twisting, the giant threw his opponent backward a few steps. Shouts broke out from the soldiers on both sides, with the Israelites calling for their man to stand up and the Philistines chanting the name of their champion. The Israelite did, breathing heavily, but with an unwavering spirit, blood streaming from a cut on his cheek. By using speed and darting in and out, he changed tactics and made the giant move and wear down. However, the giant had incredible endurance. He was able to pivot and block with terrifying accuracy because his unusual feet held onto the uneven battlefield and prevented him from slipping. However, one mistake can bring down even the strongest fighters. By pretending to stumble, the Israelite enticed the giant into a forceful blow. The Israelite rolled to his feet at the last second and used all of his strength to drive his blade upward as the giant lunged toward the fallen man, his sword arcing. The giant's breastplate was just below where the steel made its mark. The giant's eyes registered the shock, displaying an expression halfway between incredulity and rage. He stumbled backward, his armor's elaborate engravings leaking blood. His sword clanged against the stones as his spear fell first, but he didn't fall all at once. The giant stood still in those last moments, according to witnesses, his odd hands slowly curling as though he were counting his fingers one last time. He glanced around, not in terror, but with a look no one could quite read, as if he were looking for something outside the battlefield. The enormous form then fell apart as his knees gave way, sending a spiraling cloud of dust skyward. With their living mystery dead, the Philistines let out a cry of dismay. With renewed confidence, the Israelites charged forward. The giant's body was motionless, and the winners were only intrigued by his extra fingers and toes. Regardless of his origin, divine, cursed, or just the result of a unique birth, his life ended just like that of every other mortal. Stories of his fall proliferated in the days that followed, just as swiftly as the legends that had surrounded him during his lifetime. His peculiar features were attributed by some to ancient bloodlines that dated back to the Nephilim. Others wrote it off as a natural anomaly, evidence that even the most peculiar of people could be defeated with skill, bravery, and divine intervention. His eerie last moments, however, were the same in all versions of the story. The silent counting of his 24 numbers, as though calculating the length of his own life before entering whatever lay beyond the mortal world. The smell of sweat, dust, and expectation filled the tense valley. The loud voice that reverberated through the hills every morning and evening had been the only thing breaking the days-long standoff between the two armies. A giant of a man, he stood there with his enormous frame covered in armor that gleamed in the unrelenting sun. The metallic clink of his scaled bronze plates sounded like the steady beat of a war drum, and every movement he made was designed to intimidate. With one of his massive hands, he casually held his spear shaft, which was as thick as a weaver's beam. The sword at his side appeared to have been made for a legendary hero rather than a regular warrior, and the spear he's alone weighed more than the combined weight of many men's weapons. Goliath of Gath was more than just a warrior. He was the physical manifestation of Philistine power. He appeared to be more beast than man to the Israelite soldiers observing him from the other side of the valley. Every word he spoke was tinged with derision, challenging any Israelite to approach him. His voice would resound like thunder as he yelled, "Select a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." The conditions were straightforward, a duel to determine a nation's destiny. But nobody moved for days on end. The image of that enormous silhouette, the sunlight glinting off the iron and bronze that seemed to make him untouchable, was too powerful for even the most valiant warriors to get rid of. Every time Goliath returned unopposed, the Philistines roared with laughter, and the Israelites stood in uncomfortable silence, their faith put to the test. Although they had previously encountered giants, Goliath was unique. He exuded complete confidence, and his presence served as a reminder of Israel's previous anxieties, those ancient Anakim warriors, whom even seasoned spies had once declared to be invincible. His ancestry, which was a blend of Philistine and Rephaim, had given him an exceptional combination of strength, size, and talent. David entered this tense standoff as a shepherd boy sent to bring his brothers bread and grain, not as a warrior. The scene in front of him was unreal, two armies at a standstill, with one man's challenge determining their fate. As the giant taunted Israel once more, David's gaze followed his every move. David, however, saw something completely different, a man who was disobeying the living God, where others saw an immovable wall of flesh and armor. The spark that ignited the fire within his heart was the real provocation. People were shocked when David offered to take on Goliath. King Saul questioned him, his own brothers reprimanded him, and the soldiers' whispers portrayed him as either stupid or suicidal. However, David's confidence was rooted in his past and did not stem from conceit. He recalled how, using only a sling and his trust that God would save him, he had struck down the bear that roared in hunger and the lion that had lunged at his sheep. Why hadn't God saved him from those Philistines? One of the story's most telling moments is when David turned down Saul's armor. The coat of mail and the bronze helmet he tried on were heavy, unaccustomed, and unwieldy. David knew that attempting to match strength with strength would not win against a giant who relied on intimidation and sheer mass. He had to battle his way, quickly, precisely, and with faith in God's hand to lead him. He then took off his armor and made his way to the brook that sliced through the valley floor. This is where the story's symbolic core emerges. David carefully selected 5 stones from the smooth, flowing water. Smooth stones that have been sculpted by the current over years, rather than rough rocks or large pieces of debris. This appeared to the untrained eye to be nothing more than the collection of sling ammunition. However, it was more than that within the complex web of biblical symbolism. He only needed 1 stone, so why 5? According to some academics, David foresaw that Goliath had brothers, 4 additional giants who might emerge after their champion was vanquished. David might have been saying that he was prepared for each one when he took 5. Others interpret the number 5 as a representation of God's favor resting on David and as a symbol of grace in Hebrew thought. Others point out that David was thoroughly preparing militarily, not because he questioned God's ability to deliver him, but rather because readiness and faith are frequently linked. The stone's smoothness was also important. From a sling, smooth stones fly more true and straight. Unlike rough stones, they do not catch the air. These stones had been refined by the constant shaping of water, just as God had refined David through years of lowly shepherding. They became an image of a life ready for its appointed time in David's grasp, not by coercion or arrogance, but by gradual, invisible molding. As David got closer to the Philistine lines, the atmosphere became quiet. The sight must have been offensive to Goliath. His army cheered as he squinted against the sun and then let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He looked at the shepherd's staff in David's hand and yelled, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" His taunts came out like poison, promising to feed the wild animals and birds David's flesh. David didn't recoil. He responded, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts," in a steady, determined voice, rather than one of terror or rage. Both armies heard the words as they traveled across the valley. The moment's equilibrium changed just a bit when someone responded to Goliath without shaking for the first time. The giant moved forward, spear ready to strike, armor rattling. On the other hand, David ran toward him rather than away. With practiced ease, he slipped one of the smooth stones from his pouch into the leather sling. The stone was released after his arm swung in a tight arc, with the cords whistling in the air. Driven not only by skill, but also by the belief that God was with him, it flew faster than the human eye could follow. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The giant's body appeared to freeze for a moment before collapsing forward with a crash that reverberated throughout the valley as the stone struck Goliath's forehead, sinking deeply. With their champion, their tall, unbeaten warrior, fallen at the feet of a boy who had no armor, no sword, and no earthly motivation to triumph, the Philistines stood in stunned silence. David came close, grabbed the giant's own enormous sword, and killed the legend with a single precise blow. The Israelites charged forward, driving the Philistines out of the field as they broke and fled in terror. Long before the sword fell, however, the deeper victory had already been achieved. It was a victory of God's might over human strength and of faith over fear. Additionally, those 5 smooth stones continued to serve as a silent reminder of the giant's fall, as well as the readiness, faith, and invisible preparation that had preceded it. David picked 5 stones that day, even though he had only needed 1. The underlying message persisted. The result would have been the same even if more giants had arrived. The story of the shepherd who rose to become king started to take root in the shadow of Goliath's downfall, and the effects of that triumph would last for generations. It was more than just collecting ammunition when David reached down into the brook and picked out 5 smooth stones. It might have appeared to the untrained eye like a shepherd boy getting ready to use a sling. The question of why David chose 5 stones when he ultimately only needed 1 to defeat Goliath has baffled academics, theologians, and storytellers for centuries. Although Scripture only describes a brief scene, it has given rise to a multitude of interpretations, some with historical roots and others with deep symbolic and spiritual significance. The idea that David took 5 stones because he was getting ready for more than just Goliath is one of the most widely held beliefs among biblical scholars. The Bible states in 2 Samuel 21 that Goliath had 4 brothers, all of whom were giants and fierce fighters like him. David would also need to be prepared for his family if the duel with Goliath turned into a larger dispute with them. According to this interpretation, the act becomes a declaration of complete readiness. David wasn't just entering the valley to rashly attack a single man, he was preparing for the potential that vanquishing 1 giant might unleash the fury of 4 more. This preparedness reveals a lot about David's mentality. He did not act as though defeating Goliath would eliminate all threats. Instead, he moved with the silent confidence that if God gave him the strength to fall one, he would also give him the strength to fall them all. Many people view this posture as an example of how to deal with life's obstacles, to be ready for both the battle that lies ahead and the ones that might come right after. The number itself adds another level of significance. Numbers have a lot of symbolic meaning in Hebrew thought. For instance, grace is often linked to the number 5. According to some interpretations, David's choice of the 5 stones was an unintentional or possibly profoundly spiritual reflection of the grace of God that would be bestowed upon him during combat. According to this perspective, the 5 stones were carried into the field as reminders of the invisible power directing his hand, not merely as weapons of war, but as material representations of divine favor. Others relate the 5 stones to what is commonly referred to as the Law of Moses, which is the first 5 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. According to this interpretation, David's sint serve as a tangible symbol of his adherence to God's word. These stones served as the physical basis for David's assault on the giant, much like the law had served as the cornerstone of Israel's covenant with God. The truths and promises that the law represented served as his weapon in addition to his sling. It's also noteworthy that smooth stones were chosen rather than ones that are jagged or rough. Over time, the continuous flow of water shapes smooth stones, wearing away their rough edges with continuous pressure. They are perfect for a sling because they fly more accurately, faster, and straighter than irregular stones. Some see a reflection of David himself in this detail, molded and perfected by years of lowly shepherding, tried by adversity, and prepared by God's steady hand of shaping. David had been ready for this moment in the fields long before he set foot on the battlefield, just as the stones had been ready in the brook for years before they were selected. Additionally, carrying more than 1 stone made perfect sense from a tactical perspective. No seasoned sling user would bring 1 projectile into battle. Quick reloads are necessary for slings, so David would have to fire again right away if the first shot missed the target or only wounded it. David made sure he had options by carrying 5 stones. The accuracy and force of his first shot are further demonstrated by the fact that he didn't need to reload. However, the additional stones demonstrate that his careful planning was not incompatible with his faith in God. The theme of striking a balance between preparation and faith strikes a deep chord with readers of the narrative. Too frequently, faith is thought of as reckless risk-taking, but David's selection of 5 stones shows something different. In its purest form, faith is preparation based on trust rather than the lack of preparation. David respected the practical realities of battle enough to be prepared for whatever came his way, but he also had faith that God would deliver him. Connecting the 5 stones to the notion of dealing with several giants in life has additional symbolic depth. A different type of trial, such as fear, doubt, temptation, opposition, or loss, could be symbolized by each stone. David's few stones thus serve as a metaphor for the toolkit of prayer, faith, courage, perseverance, and wisdom that one may bring to their own conflicts. The stones serve as a reminder to be prepared for any challenges that may arise after the initial one. Some theologians have even gone so far as to say that David's deed was a prophetic gesture, portending not only Goliath's defeat, but also the ultimate destruction of all of God's people's adversaries. According to this interpretation, the 5 stones resemble a proclamation in the language of war that the might of the God David served has already sealed their doom, regardless of how many adversaries may emerge. In the days of ancient warfare, the psychological impact of witnessing a warrior get ready for battle was equal to that of the actual combat. The Philistines might have misinterpreted David's readiness as arrogance or overconfidence when they saw him approaching with a staff, a sling, and a pouch from which he drew not 1, but 5 stones. However, the sight of this young man, who was obviously armed for multiple strikes, walking fearlessly into the giant's shadow, must have stirred the Israelites as they watched from their ridge. It's also critical to keep in mind that David probably made his decision in a matter of seconds. He didn't take a seat by the brook to ponder theology for a long time. His hand moved quickly, choosing stones almost instinctively. But years of real-world application and faith in God had molded that instinct. He picked stones that matched his skill, fit his grip, and bore the weight of a faith that had been tried in the past. His preparedness was the result of a life of constant preparation. It was not an accident. Because it is the ideal nexus of the pragmatic and the profound, the mystery of the 5 stones never stops inspiring contemplation. In addition to being a sensible choice made by a proficient sling user, it is also a rich symbol that alludes to more profound realities regarding faith, preparedness, and the character of God's deliverance. David entered the valley with more than enough stones for the job, regardless of whether one interprets the 5 stones as a reference to Goliath's brothers, a symbol of divine grace, a link to the law, or a useful tool for combat. Perhaps the lesson that can be drawn from the handful of stones is that we should approach our own giants with a great deal of readiness, grounded in faith and honed by preparation, rather than just the bare minimum. Although the initial blow may result in victory, a true warrior's heart is prepared for any subsequent conflict. The wars that ensued after Goliath's downfall were a succession of unrelenting conflicts dispersed over space and time rather than a single, decisive campaign. The shadow of that first duel in the Valley of Elah, where a shepherd boy had defeated a giant using only a stone and a sling, hung over every conflict. These subsequent conflicts, however, were fought by David's seasoned soldiers, men who had suffered with him, bled with him, and shared in his triumphs, rather than by David alone. They were brave enough to pursue the remaining giants of the Philistine line after witnessing what God could accomplish through one obedient man. The giant Ishbibonob's appearance from the Philistines' ranks marked the first of these encounters. His weapon, a huge spear with a head weighing 300 shekels of bronze, was unlike any other weapon carried by regular soldiers. It was the kind of weapon that could crush a man with a single blow. Its immense size implied strength beyond human capacity. David himself became dangerously exposed in the confusion of combat. He barely survived death as Ishbibonob closed in on him, exhausted from the long battle. One of David's most devoted warriors, Abishai son of Zeruiah, stepped in at that precise moment. Before the giant could deliver his fatal blow, Abishai knocked him down with the accuracy and swiftness of a man who had been in combat for a long time. Although the battle was brutal and ended in a pile of steel and blood, the outcome was clear. David's men vowed that day that their king would never again put himself in danger of dying in battle because he was the lamp of Israel, and they could not allow that light to go out. The next battle was at Gob, a battleground where another Philistine giant's blood would soon be drank by the dust. Here, the Israelite forces were opposed by the silent and powerful figure of Saph, also known as Sippai. In contrast to Goliath's boisterous, arrogant demeanor, Saph's quiet was eerie. He was a lethal force who let his skill do the talking. He moved without wasting any motion. That day he was confronted by Sibbecai the Hushathite. The battle was unrelenting, with both warriors' arms shaking from the crushing force of each blow and the hiss of steel against steel. But Sibbecai persisted, motivated by the recollection of what these giants had done to Israel. He broke through Saph's defenses with a last, well-timed blow, sending the enormous figure tumbling to the ground. One of the Philistines' most powerful fighters was eliminated by his passing. As though the very soil at Gob cried out for blood to be shed between Israel and the giants' descendants, another conflict broke out there. Lami, Goliath's brother, was the fighter this time. His spear shaft was said to be thick and precisely balanced for a warrior of his size, resembling a weaver's beam. Elhanan, son of Jare-Oregim, whose greatest assets were speed and agility, was tasked with confronting him in battle. Lami's strikes swept the air like a battering ram's swing as he battled with a confidence derived from his ancestry. But in search of a gap, Elhanan darted in and out of his reach. It was abrupt when it happened, an upward thrust that snagged Lami beneath the armor, causing him to sink deeply and end the battle before he could recover. The Philistines lost yet another pillar of strength when Goliath's brother passed away and joined him in the quiet of the afterlife. The most unusual of the four brothers, an unnamed giant with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, was the last to fall. Instead of being a disadvantage, this physical defect appeared to give him an unusual grip and sense of balance when fighting. There were rumors of his unusual origins that pervaded his reputation among the Philistines, as though something unearthly had marked his birth. He attacked Israel at Gath, which was long recognized as a giant clan stronghold. He mocked Israel's armies during the conflict, hurling taunts not only at their soldiers, but also at the God they worshipped. David's nephew, Jonathan, son of Shimea, got up to greet him. The giant fought with the icy resolve of an experienced killer, while Jonathan fought with the fervor of familial devotion. The giant's enormous hands gave him a crushing hold on his weapon as steel clashed with steel, but Jonathan's skill outperformed him. He brought the imposing figure down with a final accurate blow, permanently muting his blasphemous voice. Although each of these conflicts had its own significance, taken as a whole, they signaled the gradual demise of a lineage that had plagued Israel for many generations. More than just fighters, the Philistine giants represented the ancient menacing dangers that had previously seemed insurmountable. Seeing them go down one by one was like watching a legacy of intimidation come to an end. These triumphs meant more to David's men than mere military triumphs. They were spiritual confirmations that the same God who had given Goliath to David was still defending Israel. These encounters were remarkable, not only because of the giants' size and skill, but also because they were defeated by men whose names are frequently forgotten in the greater biblical story. Warriors like Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan entered the shadow of Goliath's myth and demonstrated their ability to handle the challenge. They weren't shepherd boys with tales of miracles, kings, or prophets. They were warriors who risked everything for their people, trained and fought. Their triumphs serve as a reminder that even after a well-known battle is won, there is still work to be done, adversaries to confront, and bravery needed to see the battle through to the end. The giants were not hunted in a hurry. These men kept tabs on their opponents, studied their fighting techniques, and fought them in situations where the outcome could change at any time. The Israelite warriors' refusal to be intimidated is what caused the giants to fall, not their underestimation. Blades clashing with bone-jarring force, shields breaking under the weight of powerful blows, and the battlefield reverberating with the cries of the victorious and the dead. The duels were grim and perilous. The giants were no longer a threat to Israel when the last of Goliath's brothers perished. Their bodies were buried in the places they once ruled, and their names vanished into the history books. However, the stories endured, not just as accounts of physical prowess triumphing, but as a reminder that when bravery, skill, and faith come together, even the most formidable foes can be vanquished. The men who fought these battles did so because their king, their people, and their God required it, not because they were seeking fame. and it was sufficient in the end. Accounts that have long been missing from the majority of Western translations are preserved in the Ethiopian Bible, one of the oldest and most comprehensive biblical canons in existence. Expanded stories that provide a more optimistic, albeit frequently somber, light on the giants' beginnings can be found within its pages. The Ethiopian tradition persists, offering names, motivations, and cosmic ramifications where the standard Genesis account only makes a fleeting, almost enigmatic reference. There were giants in the earth in those days. Here, the Nephilim's shadowy figures come into full view, their existence directly linked to the Heavenly Watchers' rebellion. These Watchers were an angelic group sent to keep watch over humanity, according to the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. Their initial mission was to watch and lead humanity, not to meddle. However, what started out as a guardianship mission turned into a defiance. They left their heavenly position and took wives for themselves after being captivated by the beauty of human women. This act violated divine law and upended the order of creation. It was more than just a passionate moment. A new race known as the Nephilim, giants of immense size and strength, was created as a result of their union with mortal women. These were not your typical tall men, they were hybrids, inherited the frailty of flesh from their human mothers and an unnatural strength from their angelic fathers. Their supremacy over early humanity is a recurring theme in the Ethiopian narrative. Living in harmony with humans was not enough for these giants. When the earth could no longer support their massive resource consumption, they resorted to violence. They started eating the cattle, then the crops, and finally the people. The Ethiopian text goes into great detail, characterizing the giants' descent into violence as a result of their ravenous appetite. An era of terror resulted from what had started out as a union of beauty and strength, turning into a curse on the planet. According to this tradition, the giants were also extremely knowledgeable creatures, but not in a wise way. Their angelic fathers, the Watchers, had taught humanity sciences and arts that God forbade. The knowledge of the heavens was twisted into astrology and sorcery. Women learned to use adornments and enchantments to entice, and men learned to forge weapons of war. With weapons and strategies far beyond what the early human tribes could withstand, the giants themselves became masters of destruction. As pride and greed took hold, wars broke out not just between humans and giants, but also among the giants themselves. According to the Ethiopian story, the world is descending into anarchy, with blood soaking the ground and the cries of the oppressed reaching God's throne. The flood became unavoidable in this setting. Humanity was morally and genetically corrupted. The giants' bloodline had become so entwined with humanity that there was no longer any purity of lineage. One noteworthy observation from the Ethiopian Bible is that the flood was meant to purge the earth of the tainted seed of the fallen people, not just to punish sin. Noah is characterized as being perfect in his generations, meaning that the angelic corruption had not affected his ancestry. By illustrating the flood as a means of both judgment and preservation, a means of re-establishing the equilibrium of creation, this detail enhances the story. Ethiopian tradition, however, holds that the flood did not completely eradicate the giants. There were survivors even though the majority died. Some claim that this was due to the wives of Noah's sons, who carried the diluted blood of the Nephilim, while others claim that it was due to secret havens. Later, giant clans like the Anakim and Rephaim, and eventually Philistine warriors like Goliath and his brothers, were descended from these survivors. These post-flown giants are portrayed in the Ethiopian story as shadows of their ancient forebears, perhaps smaller in size but still with extraordinary strength and skill. They were the living remnants of a rebellion that had started long before the earth was flooded. This story makes clear the relationship between the fallen angels and the giants. Even though their children were mortal, the Watchers who fathered the Nephilim were imprisoned in chains and banished to a place of darkness until the day of judgment. According to the Ethiopian Bible, some of the spirits of the dead giants evolved into the evil spirits that subsequently tormented humanity. These were restless, bodiless creatures who aimed to corrupt and cause harm. This idea creates a theological thread that runs from Genesis to the Gospels by connecting the New Testament descriptions of demonic activity with the Old Testament tales of the giants. The Ethiopian tradition also places a special emphasis on the moral obligation of the observers. The giants' acts are interpreted as a direct result of their father's rebellion, despite the fact that they are portrayed as violent and destructive. Angelic sin included betraying divine trust and abusing heavenly authority in addition to simple lust. The giants were seen by the Ethiopian scribes as the terrible, hideous result of a larger cosmic conflict. They served as living examples of what occurs when the created tries to subvert the Creator's order. The Ethiopian canon implies that these bloodlines were not completely extinct even after the time of David. There are indications of migrations, with enormous clans traveling eastward into Mesopotamia, southward into Africa, and even into regions that are well outside of Israel's borders. Ancient warrior kings whose size and might evoke the ancient Nephilim are mentioned in Ethiopian legends. These tales are woven into a tapestry of myth and history that spans continents, never fully divorced from the biblical giants. These specifics are not merely interesting facts for academics who study the Ethiopian Bible. They are hints. The enlarged narratives offer a more comprehensive framework for comprehending the spiritual significance of Israel's conflicts with the Philistines. God's victory over forces that once threatened to corrupt the entire creation was demonstrated by the killing of a giant, which was never merely a military act, but rather a strike against an ancient rebellion. According to this interpretation, Goliath and his brother's defeat represents more than just valor on the battlefield. It marks the conclusion of a conflict that started long before David was even born. The notion that history is cyclical is further supported by Ethiopian tradition. The spirit of rebellion finds new ways to show up in every age, just as the Watchers once came down and brought corruption. Even though the ancient giants are no longer with us, the spiritual forces that gave rise to them are still very much alive and present, challenging humanity in both covert and overt ways. The story asks the reader to reflect on how the conflict between corrupted power and divine order still exists today, in addition to looking back into the distant past. The end of the giants is a prophetic marker in the biblical story, not just the conclusion of a protracted and bloody saga. The symbolic significance of their extinction extends well beyond the blood-stained battlefields of ancient Israel. It is the outward manifestation of God's assurance that evil, no matter how high or entrenched, will eventually be subdued. A larger day when all forces opposing the divine order will be judged and expelled from the historical stage is hinted at by each giant's fall, which becomes a miniature prophecy in and of itself. Israel faced more than just physical dangers from the giants, who were descended from the Nephilim, and heirs to the rebellion of the fallen angels. They were a continuation of the cosmic struggle that started prior to the flood and constituted a spiritual challenge. God's covenant with his people was directly violated by their presence in the promised land. The land that was promised to Abraham was supposed to be a holy inheritance, a place where God's presence would reside. However, it was teeming with the relics of a long-gone uprising, beings whose very existence called into question the validity of God's earthly kingdom. Therefore, eliminating these giants required both spiritual purification and military triumph. The destruction of the giants represents the ultimate downfall of all spiritual strongholds in the prophetic sense. The most powerful forces of evil will yield to God's plan, just as Goliath's overwhelming size and superior weaponry were unable to shield him from God's hand acting through David. In this sense, the fall of the giants is a reminder to the faithful and a warning to the arrogant. It proclaims that power does not equate to victory, and that any kingdom founded on disobedience to God will fall, regardless of how unstoppable it seems. This prophetic symbolism also has a very personal undertone. Giants frequently serve as metaphors for the overwhelming obstacles and anxieties that people encounter throughout the Bible. The towering issues that hang over people's lives, diseases, addictions, injustices, and oppressions of all kinds, are reflected in Israel's towering enemies. In addition to providing a historical lesson, the biblical account of the giants' demise offers spiritual support. The same God who saved his people from the actual giants of antiquity can save them from the giants of the present. The triumph of these ancient foes is a miniature fulfillment of a prophecy, demonstrating God's steadfastness in standing up for those who put their faith in him. The giants assume an even more terrifying role when analyzed through the prism of end times prophecy. According to the book of Revelation, God's people will face another battle in the future when the forces of evil under the command of Satan himself will assemble. Even though the giants are no longer a race, their origin story, which is based on disobedience, corruption, and the mixing of the sacred and the profane, provides a pattern that resurfaces in the final days. The last generation of rebels will try to contaminate what God has created, just as the giants before the flood brought corruption to the planet. The final cleansing that will occur when Christ returns to fully establish his kingdom is foreshadowed by the end of the giants. The similarities are remarkable. The giants held strongholds throughout the land during the times of Joshua and David, controlling the populace and opposing God's armies. The Antichrist and his armies will build their own strongholds in the end times, political, economic, and spiritual strongholds built to rule and deceive. Similar to how God's people's faith and obedience brought down the giants one by one, divine intervention, rather than just human strength, will bring down these last strongholds. The giants' extinction serves as a prophetic reminder that all evil will eventually come to an end, just as their demise is certain. This prophecy is further complicated by the Ethiopian tradition, which offers more detailed explanations of the giants' origins. It teaches that even after the giants were physically vanquished, their spirits turned into restless, disembodied, wandering demons that sought to corrupt humanity. Accordingly, the giants' bodies going extinct was merely the beginning of God's wrath. The last phase occurs when all demonic forces and those spiritual remnants are thrown into the lake of fire, the journey of the bell. Evil is reflected in this two-stage victory. Although we may win the battles we face on the outside in this life, the final triumph over sin, death, and spiritual opposition will be achieved in the next age. An eschatological symmetry must also be taken into account. When God stepped in forcefully through the flood and Israel's subsequent conquests, the giants were driven out at a time when humanity was on the verge of complete corruption. Humanity will once more descend into profound moral and spiritual decay in the final days. This has a clear prophetic meaning. God only permits rebellion to flourish up to a point before taking decisive action to bring about order again. Thus, the end of the giants becomes a pattern for prophecy, a model for how God will bring history to a head. This pattern provides both caution and assurance in today's spiritual warfare. It cautions that spiritual resistance frequently stems from forces that are much older than our current conflicts. These are not merely contemporary issues, rather, they are expressions of a long-standing conflict. However, it also gives believers confidence that God has already shown that he is capable of defeating even the most formidable foes. The giants were the superpowers of their time, unbeatable by human standards, but they were defeated by obedient warriors and shepherd boys who were armed with divine support rather than better technology. The church is also encouraged to view its mission in a similar light by the prophetic echo of their extinction. The followers of Christ are called to face spiritual giants in their own generation, systems of injustice, false ideologies, and forces of oppression that stand against God's purposes, just as David and his men methodically hunted down the last of Goliath's kin. It takes perseverance, faith, and the assurance that God is fighting with his people to win the victory. It never happens overnight. The conclusion of the giants serves as a reminder that the outcome is predetermined regardless of how long the conflict lasts. In this context, even the specific detail of David removing 5 smooth stones has prophetic significance. David's act was a declaration that the war would not end with a single victory if, as many scholars think, the stones symbolized preparation to face Goliath and his 4 brothers. Prophetically speaking, it is the conviction that God provides his people with the means to win both the battles of today and those of the future. Therefore, the giants' extinction is not a singular historical occurrence, but rather a continuous assurance that God will strengthen his people until the last adversary is vanquished. This makes the fall of the giants a living prophecy that applies to every generation that faces insurmountable obstacles. It is a guarantee that the great powers of rebellion, both ancient and contemporary, will all ultimately be brought low by the might of the living God, their names vanishing into the annals of history while God's purposes endure forever. Humanity has encountered giants of every kind throughout history. Their presence looms over our lives just as large, even though they are not 9 feet tall and wield spears like we read about in the ancient Israelite battles. Fear, doubt, corruption, injustice, temptation, and the invisible spiritual forces that undermine our faith are the foundations of today's giants, not physical strength. Similar to how Goliath once made fun of Israel's armies and questioned their bravery, these contemporary foes mock us and challenge us to join the battle. Even though their shapes have evolved, they frequently have the same impact on people's hearts. They make us feel insignificant, helpless, and unsure of our chances of winning. On a personal level, contemporary giants frequently manifest as internal conflicts. For some, it is the giant of fear, an adversary that subtly tells us we are inadequate, unworthy, or incapable. Fear paralyzes us, persuading us to remain sheltered by our own fears instead of taking a bold stand. Others see addiction as the giant that enslaves the body and mind, tying people to destructive cycles. Others must bear the weight of their past mistakes, which weigh heavily on them and make the future seem bleak. Though they take place in the private spheres of our hearts, these internal conflicts are every bit as real and intense as those that take place on a battlefield. Spiritual giants that aim to control our faith exist beyond the personal. These are the falsehoods and tricks that distort the veracity of God's word and lead people to doubt and compromise. These are the distractions that divert our attention from God's purposes, the temptations that promise pleasure but ultimately result in destruction, and the cynicism that derides faith in the supernatural. Giants were once a tangible representation of rebellion against God. Today, that rebellion takes the form of movements, systems, and ideologies that run counter to the principles of his kingdom. Because they blend in with the culture around us, these spiritual giants are frequently more difficult to spot, but their influence is equally harmful. Then there are the global giants, issues so big that they appear insurmountable. Millions of people's lives are in danger as poverty, injustice, oppression, war, and environmental degradation loom over nations. These giants can weaken even the strongest hearts because they are fueled by hatred, greed, and the abuse of power. The security and freedom of Israel were threatened by the Philistines, but the security and freedom of humanity as a whole are threatened by the global giants of our day. They foster an environment of unpredictability and fear where people start to question whether justice and peace are even achievable. In this context, even the specific detail of David removing 5 smooth stones has prophetic significance. David's act was a declaration that the war would not end with a single victory if, as many scholars think, the stones symbolized preparation to face Goliath and his 4 brothers. Prophetically speaking, it is the conviction that God provides his people with the means to win both the battles of today and those of the future. Therefore, the giants' extinction is not a singular historical occurrence, but rather a continuous assurance that God will strengthen his people until the last adversary is vanquished. This makes the fall of the giants a living prophecy that applies to every generation that faces insurmountable obstacles. It is a guarantee that the great powers of rebellion, both ancient and contemporary, will all ultimately be brought low by the might of the living God, their names vanishing into the annals of history while God's purposes endure forever. Humanity has encountered giants of every kind throughout history. Their presence looms over our lives just as large, even though they are not 9 feet tall and wield spears like we read about in the ancient Israelite battles. Fear, doubt, corruption, injustice, temptation, and the invisible spiritual forces that undermine our faith are the foundations of today's giants, not physical strength. Similar to how Goliath once made fun of Israel's armies and questioned their bravery, these contemporary foes mock us and challenge us to join the battle. Even though their shapes have evolved, they frequently have the same impact on people's hearts. They make us feel insignificant, helpless, and unsure of our chances of winning. On a personal level, contemporary giants frequently manifest as internal conflicts. For some, it is the giant of fear, an adversary that subtly tells us we are inadequate, unworthy, or incapable. Fear paralyzes us, persuading us to remain sheltered by our own fears instead of taking a bold stand. Others see addiction as the giant that enslaves the body and mind, tying people to destructive cycles. Others must bear the weight of their past mistakes, which weigh heavily on them and make the future seem bleak. Though they take place in the private spheres of our hearts, these internal conflicts are every bit as real and intense as those that take place on a battlefield. Spiritual giants that aim to control our faith exist beyond the personal. These are the falsehoods and tricks that distort the veracity of God's word and lead people to doubt and compromise. These are the distractions that divert our attention from God's purposes, the temptations that promise pleasure but ultimately result in destruction, and the cynicism that derides faith in the supernatural. Giants were once a tangible representation of rebellion against God. Today, that rebellion takes the form of movements, systems, and ideologies that run counter to the principles of his kingdom. Because they blend in with the culture around us, these spiritual giants are frequently more difficult to spot, but their influence is equally harmful. Then there are the global giants, issues so big that they appear insurmountable. Millions of people's lives are in danger as poverty, injustice, oppression, war, and environmental degradation loom over nations. These giants can weaken even the strongest hearts because they are fueled by hatred, greed, and the abuse of power. The security and freedom of Israel were threatened by the Philistines, but the security and freedom of humanity as a whole are threatened by the global giants of our day. They foster an environment of unpredictability and fear where people start to question whether justice and peace are even achievable. However, the lesson from the biblical giants is that a battle's outcome is not solely determined by size and strength. Goliath's size paralyzed the Israelite armies, but David realized something they did not. God's presence and power, not just a sword or spear, are what bring victory. For us now, this truth is still true. Even though the giants we face have changed in shape, the same God who once delivered his people still does so today. The important thing is to measure the enemy's strength against our God's strength, not our strength against the enemy's size. Perspective is the first step towards having courage when facing giants. Although David did not dispute Goliath's strength or size, he did not allow them to intimidate him. Rather, he trusted that God would grant him the same victory that he had already received against the bear and the lion. We also need to remember the times that God has helped us get through challenging circumstances. We use those memories as ammunition against the doubt and fear that try to keep us motionless and silent. When we turn our attention from the issue to the one who is bigger than it, our courage increases. The second thing we can learn from the ancient giants is faith. Faith is the confident conviction that God's promises are real and that His power is sufficient. It is not wishful thinking or blind optimism. David knew that God's name would be honored that day, so he didn't go into the valley with Goliath expecting a miracle. We need to have the same confidence in our own fights. The contemporary giants we encounter are merely chances for God to show off His glory through our lives. They are not too great to overcome. Even when we cannot see the end, faith enables us to move forward because we believe that obedience will pave the way for success. Giant slaying is frequently a group endeavor, which is another potent lesson. The Bible states that although David is the most well-known giant killer in the Bible, his powerful men also vanquished Goliath's brothers in subsequent conflicts. We learn from this that we are not supposed to confront our contemporary giants by ourselves. To stay strong, we need other people's support, accountability, and prayers. Unity fortifies our resolve, while isolation leaves us exposed. Being surrounded by a community that fights for us and with us makes the giants of addiction, depression, or moral compromise much less intimidating. Facing giants also requires a spiritual discipline. We must get ready using prayer, the Bible, and the armor of God, mentioned in Ephesians 6, just as David did with his sling and stones. Physical weapons alone are insufficient to defeat today's giants. Spiritual preparedness is also necessary. Scripture serves as a reminder of God's promises. Prayer helps us align our hearts with His will, and God's armor fortifies us against assaults on our minds, hearts, and spirits. Even though the battles are intense, a soldier who is ready is much less likely to be defeated. The fact that giants fall one by one is among the most uplifting facts. Each battle had its time, and David didn't vanquish all 5 of Goliath's relatives in one day. Similarly, we don't have to overcome every obstacle in our lives at once. In order to strengthen our faith, build our endurance, and gain a deeper understanding of His power, God occasionally permits us to face one challenge at a time. Our confidence grows with each fallen giant. From a prophetic perspective, the downfall of contemporary giants serves as a prelude to the final triumph that will occur upon the return of Christ. The spiritual and global giants that afflict humanity will be eradicated once and for all, just as the giants of old were driven from the land. We are commanded to live as giant slayers in the interim, people who stand resolutely in the Lord's name, rather than submitting to fear, compromise, or despair. Our lives turn into living evidence that the same God who saved Israel is still at work today, vanquishing seemingly insurmountable foes. Ancient giants' tales are more than just historical artifacts. They serve as models for bravery, faith, and tenacity. Every Goliath we encounter, whether it be spiritual, personal, or global, gives us the chance to confidently enter the valley, knowing that the Lord is winning the fight. Even though the contemporary giants may scream, pose a threat, and tower over us, they are merely shadows that the light is waiting to scatter. The ground beneath you may feel unstable when you are standing in the shadow of your own giant. Your breath may shorten, your pulse may quicken, and your instincts may tell you to turn around and seek safety far away from the danger that lies ahead. But in that instant, you will have to make a decision that every religious warrior has faced before you. Will you fight or run? This is a question for you right now, and not for anyone else. Even if the giant you are facing doesn't have armor or a sword, it still challenges you. It could be injustice, fear, uncertainty, or temptation. And until you make the decision to stop bowing to it, it won't give up. There was no place for hesitation in the valley where David used to stand. Each stride forward was an affirmation of faith in God's ability. Like David, your decision to fight is based on who you think will fight with you, not on your level of strength. In the face of your difficulty, you might feel insignificant, but in God's eyes, that is more than sufficient. Today, the same Lord who led the stone that brought Goliath down is prepared to lead your hand. That is faith's power. That is a giant killer's bravery. Therefore, I pose this question to you as a fellow traveler on this journey, rather than as a storyteller. What will you do when your giant rises before or you? Will you allow its voice to overpower the veracity of God's promises? Or are you going to declare, "This battle is the Lord's," with a firm spirit? The choice you make at that precise moment will determine not only your present, but also the legacy you leave behind. Because everyone who watches you fight and realizes that they too can win benefits from every victory you have over a giant. I would like to extend an invitation to you to join this expanding group of truth seekers and faith warriors if this message has touched your heart. Like this video to help spread the word about these inspiring tales. To ensure you don't miss the next exploration of the mysteries of Scripture, subscribe to the Bible Says channel. Tell us your name, city, and the precise time you are viewing this video in the comments section. We read all of them and enjoy watching this community come to life from all over the world. You can give us a super thanks on YouTube if you support this goal and would like to see more of these in-depth, visually stunning interpretations of the Bible. Every donation, regardless of size, directly supports the many hours of planning, creating, and narrating that go into creating videos like this. By working together, we can continue to reveal Scripture's untold tales and hidden chapters to those who are eager to learn. Remember that the link in the description below will take you to the English version of the entire 88-book Bible, which includes the Book of Enoch. These books are more than just books. They are windows into the ancient mysteries, the truths that link Genesis and Revelation in ways that most people have never seen, and the greater picture of God's plan. This is your opportunity to learn more about the Bible's hidden past if you've ever wanted to. However, I want to give you one final vision before you click away. Consider this. There is nothing but the sound of the wind as the battlefield spreads out in front of you. Your giant stands tall and unflinching across the valley, sure of its triumph. The crowd behind you holds its breath, wondering if you'll succeed. In that silence, you recall that the God of heaven is with you. Your stones have been selected, and your sling is prepared. The giant advances a step, the earth trembles, and instead of running away, you run toward it. As you return to your own life, I want that image ingrained in your heart. Even though your battle may not take place on a dusty field, like in ancient Israel, the idea remains the same. The giant and the divine power within you are both real. You're not here to back down out of fear. You are here to fight, to stand, to believe, and to prevail. Let me now give you a sneak peek at what's to come. Our upcoming documentary delves deeper into the shadows of biblical history, telling a tale so full of mystery and prophecy that it may alter your perspective on the Bible as a whole. The first scene? An inscription that has been concealed for thousands of years. A message from the ancient world to the last generation is illuminated by a single torchlight flickering in the shadows of a forgotten cave. The sound of footsteps, the crack of stone beneath your feet, and the whisper of a long-buried truth that is now ready to be revealed will all be audible to you. Prepare yourself then, because even though the fight against the giants may be coming to an end, the exploration of biblical mysteries is far from over. As with all warriors who have faced their giant, the greatest triumphs are yet to come.